new ways of communication. But the most important part, which is the most opportunity, is that you are practically implementing what you see. The COVID-19 pandemic is affecting all of us. We know that at some point in time, we were on lockdowns and people were inside and had to rely on forms of communication to know what is happening outside. As we gradually now move out of that, the pandemic will still be with us, but we have to sharpen our way of communicating. And now that's where the youth communicators are very much important. But also of importance is the role of technology. And it is the right time for the young people to use technology, but also know how to find innovative solutions to our country's most pressing challenges. I was actually checking the stats, the latest stats in terms of information dissemination. And the latest stats indicate that television it's still a most influential component. But in terms of the reach and the numbers, radio also is playing a very important role. But there is now a gradual shift of listenership and watching. It's shifting towards streaming of the information. Many people now can access images, can access voices through the online systems, which means that we have to look at what is our target area and which method do we use. Maybe if you allow me, Chairperson, to quickly give the following stats. To say, like in South Africa, we have 3 commercially licensed television operators. That is Starset, GCOM, and MultiChoice. And we have also 2 free-to-air operators, being the SABC and ETV. And we have 5 community television broadcasters. I think you are aware of them, so as KZN TV, Cape Community Television, Soweto Community Television, Your Faith Broadcasting Terrestrial, that is the former TBN, and Tshwane Community Television. Now, all this collectively, they offer 62 high-definition channels and over 236 standard definition SD channels to an audience of 38.2 million people. So you can see that through them, you have an audience, a captive audience of 38.2 million, which is a sizable number. If you look at South Africa now, we are close to 56 million people. So when you look at this 38.2 million, it's quite a big number. And then now, 44.4 million TV households in the country. That's what we have. And that will show you that as we develop strategies and ways and methods of reaching our people, we should have this in mind. But colleagues, don't forget the importance of radio, because in South Africa, it has been researched that radio listenership, it's 3 hours 36, that was found in 2018, to say we spent close to 3 hours 36 minutes listening to a radio. And then in South Africa, we have a captive audience of almost 36 million people that tune in to radio via a variety of devices. Others, listening to your 24 commercial stations, 21 private, and 3 are SABC public commercial ones, with 16 again in SABC platform that are public service broadcasting stations. But we do have also 264 community radio stations, and that is the platform to look at. To have 264 community radio stations, how do we make sure that we bring them to the level where they can play a very important role? Let me give you quite a quick example of what we have done. During the beginning of the lockdown in March, as GCIS, we looked at all avenues of reaching everybody around. And we realized that there are community-based media. Those platforms are actually reaching to the people per target area and on the ground. And we made sure that we bring them on board. And we have to thank also the other partners that came. So when there is a briefing, it is also given to your community radio stations in all the 9 provinces. Also in the same time with your main commercial stations. And that have seen quite a change in terms of people's listenership. People have now started to listen to your community radio because the content, they can get the same content at the same time that your commercial and your established media houses are providing. So that also gives a challenge to say the youth mostly now, there are those that are already running their own private radio station on your YouTubes and so on, but there are those also that are running your television channels privately. So it is a challenge to say, how do we also bring them on board? But also the main thing that the COVID-19 has taught us that we have to reach to each and every person. So it's a challenge to say, how do we inculcate them into the broader mainstream of messaging, of sharing content? Yes, we are aware of the different platforms that they are saving on in terms of your channeling, your payment, your Centec charges, and so on. But at the same time, we are interested in the content that it should reach. So we hope that today's session, as we go through it, will be able to assist us to unpack further those challenges, but also to learn from the practitioners on the ground on how certain things are working. But of importance also is the direct experiences that we'll be learning from the speakers that are here. The speakers that are here are tested, they are right there, they know actually what affects us on daily basis. So it's going to be a nice sharing, information sharing exercise that will also assist us. Chair, maybe before I step off and to allow the session to continue, let me touch on the issue of fake news. This is a phenomenon that is new, but fast growing. So it's a phenomenon that we have to be on the alert of, especially because it plays and finds space in the area that they will be dealing with. Fake news are spread easily through social platforms, and then they can actually even cause a damage if we are not aware of them. So it's also a precaution to all those who practice privately on the media space to say, verify the information before you share it, so that ultimately you should not be, you should not create a pool of untrustworthiness that will go through the people. So that is the thing that I want to also emphasize, to say in that space, make sure that you verify the information before you share it, and then that will create credibility. I think the chairperson, as you continue with this, you'll be able to touch also on the website that colleagues can use, the WhatsApp line that they can use to also report fake news, because this affects all of us, and then we have to make sure that we deal with. Ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, I would like to say we are looking forward to also using the feedback of what you will be giving us, the experiences as GCIS, to further chart a proper way of how we should communicate. So this is not just a session for the sake of a session. Yes, it's quite important, it's for Youth Month, but what you will be sharing with us is what will also assist us in making sure that we smoothen communication going forward. With those words, ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you to this virtual session, and looking forward to a beautiful information sharing and interaction session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Baloyi, for warm welcome. I must say that you did touch on a lot of topics that are already challenging us to start thinking. So when we get to the engagement session, I think we will have a lot to discuss and comments and questions to ask to our masters. So as Mr. Baloyi has already said, we are joined by three specialists in the field of communications and media. We are joined by Mr. Max Mbuzana. He's a government communicator. We know him to be a specialist when it comes to managing crisis communication in government. And we are also joined by Daniel Kayaya, joining us from Zambia. He's a communication officer at MTN in Zambia. And we are also joined by Neo Liu. She is a media specialist. Currently, she's working for Power FM. So I'm gonna ask Teofato Mudubu just to come and give us the purpose of this masterclass. Why are we here today? Why is it important for us to be here today? Over to you, Teofato.
Thank you, Irene, and welcome everyone again to this masterclass. I think the most important thing about this masterclass is that it's a new venture for us as government communication and information system. And also we looked at what is it that we can harness from youth within the government communication system. And we saw that there's a lot of talent, young people really come up with ideas, and it would be fit that during Youth Month, we create a platform for them to exchange ideas with us, but mainly on topical issues. So this year, COVID-19 is the thing when it comes to news, when it comes to journalism, when it comes to the communication arena. And we felt that let's have a master class again this year, a second annual one, and we host three befitting masters that can really share knowledge with us and get us to really engage fruitfully, on what is it that we can do within this practice of communication, within the practice of media studies, and really harness a lot of new knowledge, new ideas. So the purpose is to get young people talking, because when they come into the workplace, they come in as interns, they come here to learn. But as time goes on, these people have to exit the system. The least we could do is have that intergenerational conversation with them that says, what have the people that have come before us, get to teach us, not just your mentor on a day-to-day basis. So the purpose of this masterclass is an intergenerational conversation between government communicators, those that are practicing in the system as interns, as well as those that have been here for some time. And we this year brought in Daniel from Zambia because we realized that we live in a global world, and SADC is becoming our new reality. Our president is the chairperson of the African Union. So South African youth cannot have a myopic view of the practice of communication. It's a very global practice, and hence we brought in someone from another country, young and vibrant. And I think Daniel will tell you about himself as well. He's a recognized young African leader. So I felt that it's important that we then have this intergenerational dialogue and also bring in Neo, because we need to bring in that gender balance as well. Because as you might be aware, we don't have a lot of spokespeople or people going in the front that are female in our trade. So this is just to chart a new path for you. So with those words, I'm going to hand back to Irene so that we can then continue with our session.
Thank you, Teofato. So you can tell from Teofato that we do have great masters joining us today. So there's a lot to learn today. I'm quite excited from what you were saying briefly about our masters. I'm excited to hear what they will be sharing with us today. So moving right along, on the next item on the program, I will hand over to Mr. Max Mbuzana to come and to do a presentation on government crisis communications. Max, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
If you may, please, can you
hear me?
Yeah, can we see your face? Thank you. Over to you, Max.
Okay. Good afternoon, colleagues. Especially to the young people who are joining us, it being Youth Month, and that puts you as our so the young people today become our VIPs, and then the youth in Dala, Abu Brawili, become our secondary VIPs. So I was brought in to speak on the subject of crisis communication management. And the first thing to say is that what is the purpose of this crisis communication? Communication is a crisis communication management plan is to plan for things that are anticipated or unanticipated, or anticipated things that can happen at an anticipated time. So any organization needs to be prepared for such eventualities in order to manage the communication of issues that can be potential crisis for an organization. The plan has to be structured in such a way that it sharpens the organization's ability to respond rapidly and mitigate against the risk of adverse media coverage. So a good crisis communication plan will necessarily control the flow and accuracy of information and harness the organization's resources to respond effectively to that particular crisis. And the other important thing that a good crisis management plan does is that it gets rid of the guesswork where people don't understand or don't know what's happening, and establishes certainty in the communication environment. So if we were to define a crisis, we would define it for these purposes as any situation or any issue that threatens the integrity or reputation of an organization. So I picked the example of the South African National Defence Force because it's something that all of us would relate with. The Defence Force would routinely deploy people for peacekeeping missions abroad in other countries in Africa. As you know, as part of our mandate as South Africa is to make sure that for Africa to succeed, and for South Africa to succeed, we need to have peace in Africa. So we send our military people to war-torn parts of the continent to keep peace and ensure that the countries achieve their full potential. So if there was an incident where some of our service people lose their lives, as it happened in Bangui, in the Central African Republic, that becomes a crisis for our country. And it was also a crisis because the safety of our service people there was threatened. And then if there are epidemics that threaten as a South African servicemen, let's say we are deployed in the DRC and there's an outbreak of a pandemic such as Ebola and stuff like that, it becomes a potential crisis for us. If there are major political shifts in countries where our people are deployed, it also becomes a crisis in the sense that their safety may be compromised. The environment has changed, and that would have been an environment that we had planned for as a country. So that would mean that there would be a need for communication, things like strikes by military people and so on. So in terms of determining what becomes a crisis in everyday life, we must look at prominence and scale. If a one person who is just an ordinary citizen is involved in a car accident and they pass away, that becomes a crime.
Sorry, Mr. Mbuzana, if I may you please just share the presentation on your screen? Thank you.
So you are not able to share it on yours. Sorry, Matlo, were you not able to share it on your side?
No, thanks.
Oh, okay. Now this is, I'm sorry, colleagues, I'm just figuring out how to share on Zoom. As you would imagine, it's a very new thing for us who are youth and Dala. I'm trying to find it.
Just press the green arrow, the arrow pointing up, or share the screen.
Yeah. How will I know? I've tried to share it. Please let me know if it has come through. Has it come through?
No, not yet. Yeah, sorry, Mr. Max, you just need to upload the document on.
Yeah, I'm trying to do that. Sorry, colleagues,
no problem.
Trying to learn how to do this as I'm.
Sorry about that.
So if you look at your bottom screen, just to hide.
I think you can continue just to save time. Then we will distribute your presentation to the participants. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Okay, thanks. So I'm saying, as I was giving an example of a situation where an individual, a regular South African, is involved in a car accident, it becomes a crisis for their family because one, it will upend their lives. But a situation where a prominent person, let's say a minister, a president, a visiting foreign diplomat is involved in an accident, because of their prominence, it becomes a serious matter, which then may become a crisis. And then when we talk about the scale, we talk about the size of the incident. For instance, if a plane crashes, because it involves a lot of people, it then can become a crisis under those circumstances. So the scale, in terms of the numbers and the prominence of the person involved or people involved, also determines what can be a good determinant of what is a crisis. Now, in crisis communication, we used to have something called the golden hour. The golden hour is a concept that originates from the Second World War, where the medics realized that if you don't attend to an injured person within the first hour, there are chances of them bleeding out and dying. So within the communication context, the golden hour is that window that within which an organization is supposed to activate its crisis communication management systems and activate all the people that are supposed to be participating in the crisis management process, also to get their message out within that first hour. However, with the advent of social media, the question arises about whether we still have that golden hour. Because now every citizen is a journalist. Anyone in possession of a smartphone can tweet. And if that person happens to be an influencer, what they say can go viral and send the narrative into a tailspin very quickly, leaving communication practitioners to play catch up and communicate from a defensive position, especially in a situation where the first information is wrong. Now, as a communication practitioner, you have to play catch up and correct, and that is not the preferred communication stance to work from. So because the golden hour is no longer there, the most important time to prepare for a crisis is now before a crisis happens. So communication practitioners should develop a crisis plan, set up a communication management team, do scenario planning. If you are an airport, for instance, you should plan for a crash, you should plan for a gas leak, you should plan for various different scenarios that may arise. And then in relation to each scenario that you have established, you must develop communication systems to support effective crisis communication against that scenario. For instance, you must have pre-approved holding lines that you can change. For instance, if it's in relation to a plane crash, the pre-approved line may say something to the effect that, yes, we can confirm that such and such an airplane has crashed at this place, and more information is still being gathered. So that allows you to occupy the communication space within that first hour, because the message has already been approved by those that are supposed to approve the messaging. So when the incident happens, there isn't that lag where you are still running around trying to get, firstly, documents drafted, secondly, getting people to approve the documentation. So even things like spelling errors, typos that can happen when you are rushing are then dealt with prior to the incident. So you are able to hit the ground running within that life-saving golden hour. Now, when you actually start with the actual crisis communication process, the important things, I debated in my mind about what to start with, what to do or what not to do. So I thought it's important to start with what not to do, because that's where people really get caught up in a crisis and exacerbate the crisis in the way they respond to it. For instance, some communicators will switch off their phones. You must never switch off the phone. The story doesn't fully rely on you. It will go ahead whether you say something or not. So don't play ostrich praying that the crisis will go away, because when you do that, you think if you don't say anything, the crisis will blow over. You are allowing a lot of voices. You are allowing a narrative that you're not controlling to carry on, and then you lose the initiative. So this thing of you being aware of a negative story in your organization and then waiting for it to go public before you communicate doesn't help. Don't lie. Don't sugarcoat the facts. Take control of the flow of bad information. So if you are aware of bad facts relating to negligence, relating to something that your organization is responsible for, you should be the first to declare it. And if you declare it, you are able to declare it in your own way. For instance, you can highlight the action that your minister or your CEO is doing, what the CEO is doing to deal with the problem as you have identified it. So you set the tone yourself. And then don't resort to no comment. The story will be far worse without your comment. Or if it's a really bad story and you say no comment, it means you are actually not concerned about what would be of concern to the public. So no comment doesn't work. Most importantly, as a crisis communication practitioner, don't wing it. You can't use guesswork in a crisis situation. You must be fully aware of the the fact. So it is important for all organizations to keep their crisis communication practitioners fully appraised about the facts surrounding an incident, even the bad facts. Don't try and hide the bad parts from the communication practitioner. Leave it to them to figure out the best way to explain the bad things to the public. So communicators should always be kept in the loop. If there is a team of 5 people that is deciding how the organization should respond to a crisis, the 5th one should be a communicator. If there's 3 people deciding how an organization should respond, the 3rd one should be a communicator. So always the communicator should be there to fully understand the context, understand the full facts, and determine the pace and tone of the communication. The other important thing is not to treat the media like they're an enemy. I'm sure some of us have watched briefings where the communicators were hostile, and you can predict that if the communicators were hostile towards the media, the story will take a very negative slant. So it is very important not to treat the media like their enemy. We need to treat them as partners in communicating to members of the public. You cannot try and start a war with people who have got lots and lots of ink space in newspapers, because they will use it to a disadvantage. The other thing that we shouldn't do is to talk to journalists before any official communication, because that opens a number of strands of messaging. And by the time official communication is released, you may have more facts that were released than what you released earlier, and that may put your communication plan at a disadvantage. The other important thing is not to allow unauthorized people to communicate on behalf of the organization. So, for instance, if there's an incident at a hospital, you can't have the porter who is pushing patients in and out of the hospital communicating about it. They may not understand the full complexity of the issue. So it's better if it's the CEO of the hospital or a matron of the ward concerned that's dealing with the issue. So you need to make sure that it's the most qualified person that communicates. And then don't communicate mixed messages on any specific issue. So if you have got two principals that are speaking, all of them must support each other. You can't afford to have a situation where 2 principals are contradicting each other, because when that happens, you end up with a confused public. They no longer know, and your message credibility suffers, because now they can no longer know whether to trust your messaging or not. Importantly also, don't bombard the public with too much information. There's something called infobesity. It's a word that comes from, I think it's derived from obesity, because information overload impacts your public's ability to process information and take decisions. The other important thing is not to point fingers or divert criticism, because blaming others will quickly dilute your reputation, and you will provoke other people to rebut, and that now changes the narrative. And then don't use self-serving messages trying to save face with things like, if we had known what we know before, we know now, we would have done better, and so on. Acknowledge, take ownership, and apologize if you need to. because we're all communicators here, I assume we understand that long-winded explanations sometimes end up losing your audiences. And then the other things that you should do, you must communicate from the victim's point of view using compassionate language that demonstrates solidarity and sympathy. For instance, if it's a platoon of South African Defence Force soldiers that have been killed in another country, you must communicate in a manner that shows that you appreciate the fact that families have lost loved ones, communities have lost loved ones. You cannot speak from a militaristic government perspective that says, this is what we're doing, but you are not paying any attention to the perspective of those who are suffering the most. And then use people with authority to speak on behalf of your organization, because if you have an organization that has a CEO, you can't use, with all this due respect to administrative clerks, you can't use an administrative clerk, because the higher the person that speaks, the more it appears you are taking the matter serious. So it is very important as well to use the most prominent people to to communicate on your behalf. Demonstrate action. Highlight visits to the affected people by principals, because that shows that human element. Correct erroneous information and rumors with current and accurate information. Set up systems for verification and rapid elimination of fake news. I think our government has done well in this instance when it comes to fake news, because we even have now a fake news stamp, where if something is detected quickly, it is quickly stamped as fake news and distributed rapidly. So that assists, because fake news is becoming very complex these days, and the believability of it is going higher, because the people really take their time and they sound even scientific on issues related to things like the current pandemic that we're dealing with. So it is important to quickly dispel the myths, because otherwise it may create anxiety in the communication space. As a communication practitioner, you must ride the wave. For as long as your issue is prominent in the environment, you must continue to communicate. It doesn't help to communicate once and then go back and hide in your cave. You need to constantly communicate. You must also commit to members of the public and the media on the number of communication engagements that you're going to have, because that assists in them knowing when to expect clarity on certain issues, when to ask certain questions. So if they know that your briefings are every Tuesday or your briefings are every day at 3, then it assists and it buys you time to deal with issues without them asking, when are you going to speak on this? So it's important to have that regular communication network. Winston Churchill once said, we must never waste a good crisis. So a crisis can be an opportunity for you as an organization to profile the organization's capability to respond. This is something that we did very well as South Africa when some of our citizens were involved in an incident where a guest house collapsed at a church in Nigeria. Because we discovered, along with the rest of South Africa, as we were informing them, that we have got various capabilities within the security forces of our country, very, very advanced victim identification systems. We've got professionals who are well-renowned. So we're able to use that crisis to highlight our capabilities as the country. Secondly, we're able to highlight profile specific individuals who are well-renowned and who have got a lot of technical expertise. So that crisis, as much as it's bad, it's also an opportunity to highlight your technical expertise and your organization's capabilities to respond to crisis. And it's also an opportunity to demonstrate a caring human face of the organization. I'm sure most of us would know the Minister of Education, the MEC of Education in Gauteng, because whenever someone is killed or there's an incident that affects anyone within the education sector, he is there with the family, he is there with the victim. So that demonstrates that caring human face of the organization and the principal concern. And we must also communicate lessons learned and mitigative measures in place to prevent recurrence. So for instance, if something happened, because for instance, if you look at I'm not saying this was the best way to communicate a crisis, but the Fort Kruger situation, they went in, they recalled the cars, they investigated the cause of the fires, and they assured people that they dealt with the problem. I'm not sure how successful they were, but I'm just saying that they were able to demonstrate that ability, firstly, that they care, secondly, that they've put in mitigative measures, and then that it will never recur again. And then the other important thing to do is to have a debrief session to assess and sharpen your organization's crisis management capability. So with each and every crisis, you have an opportunity as an organization to review how you respond to crisis. And then where you found that perhaps the sign-off process was too tedious and it led to lags in responding by government or by the organization, you can then afterwards try to find ways of shortening those processes. And where you feel like you didn't have enough resources, as you review your crisis management plans, you are able to update them and make sure that now going forward for future crises, you have all that you need. And then there are critical enablers for crisis management. Some of them, firstly, I've mentioned media. Earlier, I mentioned media monitoring capability. That should include social media. We must never ignore social media. Of course, access to decision makers. You must have content development expertise. You must have a public engagement plan. You must have a key list of influencers and other capabilities that you need in order to respond effectively. So yeah, I will pause there and Chairperson, and back to you for any questions of clarity that may be required, may arise. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Max Mbuzana, for a comprehensive presentation on crisis communications. You did highlight key pointers, so I think that you gave us more than we can chew at the moment, but I think that is great. So I'm going to give our interns a few moments just to ask a question or two, or just to comment. So I'll start with the interns in our venue here. If there's anyone in the venue, we have one hand. Please introduce yourself, your name, and you can then ask a question to Max.
Hi, Max.
Hello.
From SA News. You did mention that we should never ignore social media, right? And one of the things that spreads faster than news or death right now is actually meme. We have our own local meme factory here in South Africa that also contains many components that you find in advertisements or any marketing campaign, whether it be fear, be it humor, or politics, and so forth. So
the sound is low, man.
Sorry?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you properly. Can you please raise your voice?
Okay, I'm saying we have our own memes which are generated locally here in South Africa in relation to current affairs and what's happening in the environment around us, even regarding with the COVID-19 situation that we're in. Am I clear now?
Yeah. You are saying something in relation to the current pandemic?
Yes. I'm saying the fastest thing to spread, faster
Yeah.
than news or death, is memes.
Oh, memes.
And
Yes. Correct.
yes, memes. So how do we encourage for the generation of memes in such a capacity that they are educational? Do you understand? Because there was some disruption back when it was reported by one of the South African broadcasters that memes are a problem, and that people who create memes should refrain from doing so because of its tarnishing of officials' images and the reputation of government. So how do we make sure that memes are educational to our people? Because this is how the youth raise their concerns, and this is how they are able to put their point across. That's the first question. So how do we keep memes there? How do we educate them on how to make memes that will help us instead of what they have been reported to be doing? Representation of government, ministers, and all government officials. My second question is in relation to influencers. We're speaking about the golden hour, and I want to know, since not all influencers are students in communication, so they have no experience in communication but have a huge following, how do we give them training, or how do we disperse this information to them so they know when to post certain news and how to post that news? How do we give them that education? Those that us people who study communication may have, and they may not have, but they do have an influence over people due to their large influence. And then my final question is a bit controversial, but then I want to know, how do we as youth educate the older generation, not only the older generation, but those coming up, how to use new technologies, you're in the forms of Zoom, Microsoft Teams, we saw now you're struggling to share your screen. I think COVID-19 has actually shown us that the era of old people sitting back and saying, well, this technology is for the new kids, that's not going to work, because they now also have to communicate virtually, and they may not know how to operate these new systems and these new technologies that are here. So how do we, as you, lend a helping hand so that all of us are on one page and we can pave the way for the fourth industrial revolution? Thank you.
Okay. Matlo, do I respond now, or?
Thank you. Yes, Max, you can respond. Thank you.
On the question of memes or responsible use of social media, I think we have got two priorities to balance out. One is that in the Bill of Rights, we've got enshrined there the right to freedom of expression. So that you cannot curtail, especially when it comes to people making jokes and so on and so on. But recently, which was a good development, more people are getting charged in our country for spreading these fake news on social media. So to the extent that it can be determined that the information that you are spreading is harmful, and to the extent that it can be determined that the information is malicious and fake, people can get charged. So that is a very positive development in so far as the control of the flow of information is concerned. Of course, we can continue, and government does this all the time. We issue statements urging people who use social media to do so responsibly and to desist from distributing fake news or creating fake news. So I believe that as we get more of a handle on this fake news phenomenon, we will score more victories against those who generate them, and that will serve as a deterrent in itself. So in relation to the other things where people are just making fun and so on, I mean, what can we do? It's that free. So it's about that balance between the two rights: the right to freedom of expression, and on the other side, the responsibility that attaches to that right. And then, with regard to influencers, all we can do as government or as organizations is to keep them informed, to engage them, to create channels where they get information from our perspective. From time to time, I know government has colloquiums where these people are invited as guests, and during those colloquiums, they're engaged and they get the perspective of government. And to some degree, these engagements assist government in the sense that when these influencers now decide, even when they decide to say things that are not in support of government, they do so knowing what government is doing. So you don't have absolute ignorance of what government is doing. In terms of technology, I mean, here we are sitting at different parts of the continent, because I know that one of our speakers today is in Zambia, and we're communicating as clearly as possible to one another, and we're able to transmit information, and we're able to exchange ideas. So I think there's a saying that says necessity is the mother of invention. I think it applies in this instance. We no longer have a choice. Even those who are older are now forced to learn more about the use of technology. And I myself am not clean because I couldn't successfully upload that document. I will need to have a crash course on how to quickly upload documents on Zoom. Thanks, Matlo. I think we will get there.
Thank you, Mr. Mbuzana. I just want to recognize Tlo Murifi, who raised his hand on Zoom. Over to you, Tlo. Please remember to unmute your mic.
Thank you very much, Matlo. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes,
Okay.
we can hear you loud and clear.
Thanks, Bramex, for a nice presentation. I'm just gonna touch on a few points. But before, my name is Tlo Murifi. I'm an intern at the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation for Communication, of course. So you really gave so many examples about the SNDF, the accidents, the planes. But personally, I really felt that we need to focus more on coronavirus, and so that we can be able to respond appropriately when we are faced with questions from the media. Like to give an example about what if an employee within a certain department tested positive, then how do we go on engaging the media about that information? And again, I also want to touch on the issue of fake news. Much as you say you are getting there, but I feel that our communications team, our communications and media team, are slow in responding to fake news, especially on social media, because you'll find out that one can post on Facebook that GCIS is hiring for temperature testing, blah blah blah. Then you must submit your CV by tomorrow. Let's say tomorrow. Then that person posts now. Then you'll find people certifying the documents, preparing the CV, going to GCI to submit. Then the government will respond tomorrow this time when the damage is done. So I think the media monitoring team need to also up their game in ensuring that we prevent such to happen. And one last thing, it's about the community radio station. I'm not sure if this is the right platform or this must be addressed with MDDA, but I really feel that our community media are not providing accurate information when coming to COVID-19. I don't know if they rely on fake news, or I don't know if they lack resources, because you may find out that SABC will report that, okay, the Minister of DPME, Jackson Mutembu, visited the school for monitoring, blah, blah, blah. Then that will be aired on SABC, and you'll hear it on SABC radios as well. And then 2 hours later, you'll hear it from our community radio station, which is something that I really feel they also need to do something about it. Because why should I listen to them, whereas already I've had that information from SABC? It's not that new. So now, I don't know if is there any way that the SABC can provide our community radio station, because most of them are not there to cover the event, can provide them with the information so that they can be at the same time, so to enable our gogos and umkulus at home to also listen to the radio station. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. The first point on COVID, whether on that we gave relate to COVID or not. Look, crisis communication management is a discipline. It's applicable to any crisis. I must confess that as much as I'm involved in the management of COVID from my own departmental perspective, I can't give a fuller picture. I believe there may be a speaker coming who can give a fuller picture from more hands-on involvement on this particular crisis. But I assure you that the golden hour that applies to a plane crash applies to a case of COVID, as you have indicated, within an organization. So if you set up those systems within your organization, you should be able to respond not only to COVID, but to other eventualities as they arise. And then the phenomenon of fake news. Well, I think you made a comment, which was an analysis on how quickly or how rapidly we respond as government. I don't believe that the way we respond is even, so it may vary from department to department. But my own experiences, I've said, during this outbreak of COVID, we have seen government sharpening its abilities along those lines. So I think my own assessment is that we're getting there, we're getting better and better. Of course, as you say, we need to sharpen our monitoring capabilities so that we pick them up before they do more damage. And I believe it's an area that, as government, we are continuing to sharpen our ability on an ongoing basis. I don't think there's a country in the world that you can point to right now that has a full handle on fake news. It's something that you'll have to keep on chasing, and of course we take the point that we need to do so much more quicker and more rapidly. And then in relation to community radio, I believe that GCIS is best suited to respond to it, but I'm on a daily basis distributes. It creates opportunities actually for principal through the in community of the that GCIS avails. So this is how it works. you can, for instance, record yourself as a communicator, send it through to the radio unit at GCIS, and they distribute it. So that in itself is more than community media waiting for institutions like the SABC to. But also the other important thing is that package them and report on them. I believe GCIS can respond to more in a fuller sense than I am able to. Thanks.
Thank you, Max. All the questions that are directed to the GCIS, Mr. Baloyi will respond at the end of the program. So we are noting those questions.
Thanks very much.
There's a hand from Nasipi on Zoom. Over to you, Nasipi. That's the last question for Max. Thanks.
Oh, hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. I'm Nasipi.
Hi, Nasipi. We hear you. We hear you clearly.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I'm Nasipi from Cape Winelands District Municipality. I'm an intern there. Maps, you did mention that you mustn't bombard people with too much information. And people now, and my question is, how do you keep your content eye-catchy without boring people, without boring your social media associates, especially in this time of the pandemic? We have to repeat information over and over again. So how do you keep your information eye-catchy without getting to bore people? Okay, that's my first question. The last question is, I believe that you have no control over how your message is received by your social media associates or whatever. So in times like this one, there's a lot of conspiracy information that is spreading, and people are finding it difficult to believe it if the pandemic is real or what. So how do you convince your audience or your social media associates? How do you get them believe that what you're communicating is true and is real? Thank you.
Thank you, Nasipi. The first question on infobesity. Too much information being communicated in a manner that paralyzes the public's ability to analyze and take decisions. It's something that I think we are getting better and better on, because, for instance, you would have a day blocked out in the government calendar where it's only one specific department that should brief. And I think that's ideal, because then you don't have a lot of people communicating different information, which may be complex and difficult for people to understand. So it assists that the GCIS is in full charge of the communication environment to make sure that the communication of government information is staggered. And then the eye-catching part, I believe that if you take care of the so what factor, like you can't communicate for the sake of communication. You must communicate messages that assist people to make decisions. For instance, if you, I think on COVID, we have been doing well because you say, put on your masks because this may happen if you don't put on your mask. Stay away from other people, social distancing, wash your hands, and so on. And as you walk around, you see people responding well to such messaging. And then in terms of social media is the wild, wild west. Anyone with a phone and an opinion can play in that arena. So the most important thing for government is not to shy away from the space, is to engage in the space, engage robustly, and make sure that the messages are repeated constantly. Because as you know, in communication, one of the first principles is repetition, repetition, repetition. So as long as we repeat our messaging, we make sure that the messages that we communicate assist the people. The people will follow us. Firstly, we make sure that they are credible. Secondly, we make sure that there isn't mixed messaging in what you say as government, and then you just keep on repeating the that properly packaged message, and I'm sure people will respond positively as they continue to do so. I don't know if I've responded fully. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Max, for your response to the questions. Thank you to our participants for asking the questions. So moving right along on the presentation, we have Daniel Kayaya from MTN in Zambia, who will also share when it comes to managing crisis in the corporate sector. So Daniel, over to you. Are you there, Daniel? Can you hear me, Daniel?
We can see him. I think he's having difficulty with his audio link up.
Okay. I think, Daniel, if that will help to give you more time, we can move and give our next speaker a chance to speak. And when you're ready, we will come back to you.
Hello, hi, Erin. Yes.
Yes, Daniel, we can hear you now. Thank you. Over to you.
Yes, all right, thank you very much. So hi, everyone. My name is Daniel from Zambia. I'm currently serving as a communications officer in Zambia. I've been working in that role for the past 1 year, 3 months. Previously, I have experience in broadcast journalism, also working in television and radio, and I possess a Bachelor of Mass Communication from the University of Zambia. So I was asked to do a presentation on managing crisis communication in the corporate sector, a case study of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'll just start by giving a brief background about the role of crisis communication. So Irene assured me that she's going to share the presentation with the interns on the WhatsApp group. So just a brief background of crisis communication and corporate communication is that it is vital when problems arise, and regardless of the nature of the event, companies need to be ready to respond to crisis as they come up, to be able to safeguard the reputation of the business, which is very cardinal to the overall profitability of the business. So companies need to be ready to respond to the general public as well as employees and staff without delay. So there's different categories of stakeholders who are involved that will need to be kept within the loop as the company responds to a particular crisis, like the COVID-19 pandemic. So a key element of crisis communication is the ability to anticipate a crisis before it happens. So a business can avoid the adverse impacts of any crisis if it's able to forecast a possible crisis that could come and impact on its operations. So I'll move on to crisis communication as it was practiced specifically during the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'm giving this information based on my experience working on crisis communication during the COVID-19 pandemic at MTN Zambia, and also share a few tactics that we put in place to make sure that we can just respond more proactively to the pandemic and the impact that it had on our business and our lives in general. So COVID-19 affected the global economy at an unprecedented scale. We saw literally the global economy coming to a standstill because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and life as we know it was just not the same after the wave of COVID-19 in the world. So the impact of the pandemic affected the practice of business to a great extent, because it shaped even just the way that businesses who do their work with regards to embracing a working from home culture, as well as even just putting in place safety measures for the customers that interact with, and also adhering to the different precautions that are put in place by the public health officials with regards to combating the further spread of the COVID-19 pandemic. So because of the pandemic, there arose an urgent need to effectively manage communication with all relevant stakeholders to safeguard the reputation of the business. So the key stakeholders that we considered included the customers, because for a business like MTN, the customers are key because these are the people that we serve, and we make sure that all our services are for the benefit of the customer. So there was need to always consider the well-being of the customer as they interact with us on our points of sale, and even as they come through to our offices to do business, we needed to make sure that we can communicate a positive message to our customers that will make them feel safe even as they interact with us and continue to do business with us. And then also another key group of stakeholders included the industry regulators and government agencies. So because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw a lot of interventions put in place by public health officials and industry regulators to make sure that they could just safeguard the life of people in general. So we needed to communicate to this particular group of stakeholders to make sure that we send the message to them that we are being compliant with all the regulations that they've put on board, and that we also just are working hard to ensure that we are putting in place the right measures for the continuity of the business and also the safety of our employees and our customers. Then also our members of staff, which is a key resource for the business, because we cannot get any work done without the manpower that we need. So we needed to also communicate to our members of staff that as a business, we have their safety at heart, and that we will put in place all the measures to protect their well-being as they continue to work on behalf of the business. And of course, the general public is also interested. As you may be aware, MTN is actually a South African brand, so you just know about the scale of the business. It's a huge business, and people know about it. So we also just need to communicate to the general public that as a huge corporate entity, MTN is also responding proactively to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the lives of our customers and just on the public in general. So I'm just going to share a few of the specific interventions that we put in place for our COVID-19 crisis communications. One of the key things that we did was that we drafted a company holding statement. So this statement was put in place to make sure that in the instance that we record a case, maybe in one of our service centers, or if one of our members of staff tests positive for the coronavirus, or if there's any other salient issues that would just come up around the COVID-19 pandemic, we could quickly respond to the press if they come with queries, or if there's a story trending on social media, on Facebook or Twitter or LinkedIn about our company, we could quickly just respond to that with that information that was timely prepared in the company holding statement. Then the other thing is that we also adhered to the prescribed COVID-19 preventive measures in the workplace. So we embraced social distancing. We made sure that there was hand sanitizer that was distributed. Staff were provided with face masks and other, safety tools to protect them as they go about their work. And then this was communicated through, internal comms and staff mail, just to keep staff well abreast and informed about the various measures that we were putting in place to protect their safety in the workplace. And then another key thing that we used to implement our crisis communication, make sure that the business maintains its good standing in terms of reputation amongst the Zambian people, is that we enhanced our corporate social responsibility work, which at MTN we call corporate social investment. So we upscaled that to include donations to the Ministry of Health as they were looking for material support to the COVID-19 pandemic. We reached out to the communities and different health sectors, different health centers around the country with material support. Just make sure that we could also protect the frontline staff who are working, serving the general population in the COVID-19 pandemic. And then at a group level, also rolled out what we're calling the Yellow Hope Initiative, which is a sustainable response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So every year during the month of June, the MTN Group rolls out a staff volunteer program known as the 21 Days of Yellow Care, where we just reach out to the communities and we encourage our members of staff to spend their time on projects that give back to the community. So during the year of 2020, because of COVID-19 restrictions, we had to roll out a similar program, but different in terms of implementation, called Yellow Hope, which has a focus on just responding to the COVID-19 pandemic by supporting projects and programs that are put in place to offer that response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's just some of the specific interventions that we implemented at MTN Zambia during our crisis communications responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. And then I'm just going to share finally a few lessons that I have learned working on COVID-19 crisis communications. And it's that there needs to be the business needs to be proactive and anticipate a crisis before it breaks. So with the COVID-19, I think we didn't do a very good job in anticipating the pandemic and the impact that it will have on our business. But that's a lesson that we learned as we worked on crisis communications for the COVID-19 pandemic to ensure that the business is proactive and can quickly anticipate a possible crisis that could come up. And then another key lesson is the importance of stakeholders. So as we responded to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, we worked closely with different agencies and regulators to make sure that we could put in concerted efforts in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. So it is important to work closely with the relevant stakeholders because they'll make your job easier and it will also increase your impact in terms of the work that you do. And then we also learned the value of corporate social responsibility in reputation building and maintenance of the reputation. So after rolling out a number of our corporate social responsibility programs, we could see that our reputation is being enhanced because we're positioning the company as a responsible corporate citizen who responds to the needs of the community, because ultimately the company does not operate in isolation but operates within a community, and that community is comprised of people, and these people that the company has their best interests at heart. And even as the company is serving people with its products and services, people need to have that faith in the company to know that the company will do its best to bring about the best outcome for the people. So basically, that's my brief presentation on managing crisis communication in the corporate sector, the case study of the COVID-19 pandemic. I hope that you learned something, and I will take a few questions or queries or any points of clarification. Over to you, Irene.
Thank you, Daniel. I'm on the floor just checking if we have questions. I see one hand, so I'll hand over to our colleague here to introduce himself and ask a question.
All right.
Hi, Daniel.
Hi.
Congo here, intern from SA News. Thank you so much for your presentation. Very informative. I just have two questions. Right? In any organization, corporate communication imply that you need to keep good customer relations with your customers. I just want to know what benefits does your organization offer to customers who, like in this period of COVID-19, have lost an income or a portion of their income? Apart from issuing a public message of safety and so forth, what other benefits do you offer them? And then the second question, I heard you talking
Just
about
kindly repeat
how
the question on the benefits you have for customers with regards to, is it customers that we do business with, or just a clarity on the question?
okay, what benefits do you offer to customers who have lost an income during this COVID-19 pandemic?
Okay,
Right?
all right.
Okay, cool. And then the second one, it's about what you were speaking about. You said you're basically corporate governance. And I just want to know, since corporate social responsibility is exercised, irregardless of a crisis or not, it's also good when it's can be used as a tactic during crisis. And I just want to know what is your organization doing to give back in this period that we're in. Just like how banks have started to offer relief funds, your Netflix will give you a free subscription for a period of time. What is it that your organization is giving back to its consumers? Thank you.
Okay, all right. So on the first question about customers who may have lost income because of the COVID-19 pandemic, so in some instances, the company decides to use its discretion to provide refunds or discounts or promotions for those customers in those situations. But that is after the case has been proven that the customer has lost as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and MTN's involvement in that also. So the company exercises a lot of discretion with regards to those refunds and the promotions that could be offered to the customers. And then on your other question with regards to corporate social responsibility in the period of COVID-19, so one of the key things that we did for our Yellow Hope activities, which I alluded to earlier, is we entered a partnership with Save the Children International, who have come up with an emergency program where they are feeding children in vulnerable communities who will be going back to school, because Zambian children will be going back to school. In fact, they've gone back to school this month of June. So Save the Children have got an emergency feeding program for children in these schools. So we have entered into a partnership with Save the Children to provide them with some financial support to make sure that that could enhance their operations as they roll out their emergency school feeding program to encourage more children to go to school, even despite of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the economy and on life in general. So children can be encouraged to go back to school. So this particular project was key for us at MTN because the area of education is one of our key focus areas for corporate social responsibility. So we saw it fit to partner with Save the Children International on the emergency school feeding program, which we just launched last week on a partnership. So that's one of the key things that I could mention with regards to our corporate social responsibility in the period of COVID-19. Well, apart from that, we've also done a lot of work in the health sector. Like I mentioned earlier, we donated to the Ministry of Health different COVID-19 prevention tools. And then also we've offered support to health centers around the country just to protect the safety of frontline workers as they work at responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. So I hope that answers your question. I do not know if there's any further questions from my presentation.
Thank you, Daniel. We don't have any follow-up questions. If we get questions relating to your presentation, we'll let you know. Moving right along to our next speaker, I would like to hand over to Neo Liu, who is joining us on Zoom. Over to you, Neo.
Thanks, Irene, and hi to all the participants. Thanks to Daniel. That was short, but it was quite informative. I just want to start by just highlighting that COVID-19 as a pandemic is not just disrupting communication, but it's all across the industries. For the media sector, as with many others, the virus has created both opportunities and challenges. On the one hand, social distancing has led to a spike in at-home media consumption, and growing numbers are turning to news providers for timely and trusted information about the crisis. At the same time, some of the most valuable broadcast content, such as live sports and large gatherings, were postponed or cancelled, leading to spending reallocations by advertisers and a subsequent drop in income for media companies. What this ultimately means is that newsrooms find themselves with even less resources or human capital, but having to maintain the standard and quality of news. We have obviously seen job cuts across the industries, as I said, and the media space is no different. The current disruption, it may be unprecedented, but the media industry has been upended many times before. Since the turn of the century, digitalization of content, the rise of social media, and acceleration in mobile consumption have all forced changes to the way media companies monetize content and the creative process of delivering entertainment of news. What has stayed constant is the indispensable role that media plays in society. Media don't just help us pass the time, they keep us informed. Increasingly, media create shared cultural moments and reflect who we are as a people. One of the most direct ways to gauge value for us is engagement. And on this front, the media is doing pretty well. Between 80% and 90% of us read, watch, or listen to the news and entertainment for an average of almost 24 hours during a typical week. It's no surprise that engagement with media is high, considering the variety of quality providers that there are today. But with all that said, the pandemic poses a greater responsibility on media houses to uphold ethics and have stricter rules on story verification. Of course, this is nothing new, because at the heart of journalism is the ability to give quality and credible news. This, however, is coming under increased scrutiny because COVID-19 requires us to break down scientific data and explain not only what this means, but how it affects day-to-day life. Now, even though people are plugged into the news, there's a report that's been recently released that 4 out of 10 people trust the news. That's 4 out of every 10 people in the country trust the news. This was from the Reuters Institute. They recently released a report on global media behavior, which found that concerns about fake news and misinformation remain high. It also says that of the 80,000 respondents, of the respondents, 80% of them said that they trust most news most of the time. And that is a fall of percentage from 2019. And fewer than half of the respondents, 46%, said they trust the news that they consume. The question would be asked why this is under scrutiny only now under COVID. And the reality is that it's because while crisis communication it's a school, it's a way of learning and it's a way of communicating, COVID-19 is something that's unprecedented, meaning none of us had access to any of this information prior to where we were now. So we're all literally walking blind, learning as we go, which actually requires for us to scrutinize the information that is put out there even more. And I'll explain, the different ways in which COVID-19 has pose challenges or maybe force journalism or the media space to look at itself and its practices more closely. So the points that I want to make is that COVID-19 has forced newsrooms to reflect on the many ways and new practices could limit us in a time of crisis. Newsrooms have had to revert to the old style of journalism, which allows for journalists to become specialists in specific fields, and tools of the trade have now had to be sharpened to move with the times. And this has also led to a rise in inclusive reporting with language as a key factor. Now, I've put together a list of 5 points that kind of sum this up. The first is that one of the key things that we've seen is that journalism has a lack of specializing. There's a lack of beats, as they used to be called. The growing trend in South African newsrooms is not to be so beat heavy. This means newsrooms have essentially been divided into 3 categories based on viewer, listener, or reader consumption. And these were general news, politics, and business. And that's what we've been limited to in the past, I would say, decade or so. Now, not many newsrooms still have the specialized reporting of the 90s and early 2000s. What COVID has highlighted is the lack of health journalists in the industry. Becky Caesar seems to have done this quite well and employ a number of journalists who focus on health. And while there's an abundance of news to be reported on the pandemic, newsrooms hammered by decades of layoffs often lack reporters and editors who specialize in public health reporting. And the challenge here becomes that some newsrooms are focusing on breaking COVID-19 news instead of in-depth coverage, which, of course, I think you would agree with me is a problem. The second one is how to avoid information overload, or what we are calling COVID fatigue. Now, to inform the public during these uncertain times across the country, have made pandemic coverage a priority, but the ever-changing and sometimes unverified nature of COVID-19 data being released has left journalists and researchers with challenges in providing accurate information to the public. So what have many deemed to be the solution in this case? They just release everything and they let the consumer break it down for themselves. So when you've got a myriad of information and you're not really quite sure what to leave out and what to include, because the reality is that all information is important information where COVID is concerned, we tend to just throw it all out there, which kind of leads to the information overload and essentially COVID fatigue. The way people consume news now is not the same as before. Media houses have to find ways to condense the information and make it easy to consume. And what is a growing trend is that people are finding escapism for all the heavy information. I think that you'd agree that this has led to an increase in subscription platforms for what we call escapism, Netflix, Showmax, etc. The third is fighting against fake news and misinformation. Now, the digitalization of news means that even more consumers take to social media to consume fast and easy news. This opens up the gap for fake news and misinformation. How many times have you seen images of, say, homemade sanitizers, WhatsApps, or statuses with tips on how to boost your immune system to fight COVID? And of course, journalist nightmare, fake alerts on breaking news. The ones that are currently trending at the moment are around alcohol and cigarette consumption and whether or not government will change its regulations. What has helped, but definitely not stopped, is the new regulation from government, which stipulates that anyone that creates or spreads fake news about coronavirus is liable for prosecution. So that has kind of aided us a bit. The fourth one is building a new ecosystem for checks and balances. While verification is given in all news stories, we've seen a rise in the same commentators on stories across platforms. COVID-19 has forced newsrooms to build a new database of experts to help build stories, including a range of health and economic technical experts. The most used commentators in the past, say, decade or two have been political analysts on most stories. The health aspect of COVID-19 is apolitical, and this has brought the rise of using scientists and medical experts. And my last point, or second last point, is inclusive reporting. While different platforms have their own language preferences, communication in a time of the pandemic forces the said platforms to allow expression across all languages. With limitations to access to people due to lockdown regulations, a trust system has had to be developed with the general public to gain access to news and to direct the media on the realities on the ground. As I said, people who consume news themselves have an issue with trusting the information that is being pushed or thrown at them. And what this inclusive reporting does is that it's a collaborative effort between journalists and regular citizens to build the news of the day, to get the information out to all the others who are not particularly involved. Now, taking the geographical makeup of the country into consideration meant that for the first time, underreported areas had to be included. For example, a lot of the remote areas in the Cape provinces, as well as further north in Limpopo, Northwest, and Mpumalanga, now have to have focus in order to paint a clearer picture on what the pandemic is doing and what the stats are. And also news has had to be simplified in a way that speaks to all households, regardless of social and economic standing. We've had to simplify the jargon because you would appreciate that with scientific data or medical data, not everybody necessarily understands what a comorbidity is. Well, they didn't until COVID-19. And those are some of the things that we had to break down. And I think that's just the trend in how we learn, the jargon as we go along, but it goes along with simplifying the language that is used. And another example would be, remember with the Oscar Pistorius trial, there was dolus eventualis. None of us had heard it before the time, but in the way that the message was pushed through to the public, we had to break that down on what it is it actually meant. I hope that actually that makes sense. And also for me, COVID-19 has actually been an equalizer. It no longer matters what your economic background is. It no longer matters where you're located, but the effects of the pandemic itself are actually the same, which kind of also helps us to then disseminate the information. And my last point is on sharpening tools of the trade. A lot of media houses found themselves having to give in to the digital space. Mobile journalism, although not a new term, is something that's going to be on the rise, and that's the next phase also as we step into 4IR. Newspapers have had to open themselves up for digital offerings due to restrictions of lockdown. So the way that we consume our Sunday papers is no longer the same as what it was before. And as I said, mobile journalism is seeing a sharp upward slide as journalists have to learn to deliver the news from their phones and smaller, more modern digital devices to meet consumer needs. And also fast news, because we are now battling, the fast consumption on social media. And if you are not able to kind of dispel the myths or give the accurate information in real time, that kind of gets you left behind, and it kind of shoots at your credibility as a reliable source of information. You need to establish yourself as a platform where people can easily just click and find the information. People want easy news to consume. Technology has also meant that media houses have had to adopt efficient content gathering tools to reach subjects, and it forced newsrooms to also shy away from linear reporting based solely on press conferences, which can now be accessed by everybody. The reality is that COVID-19 has forced us to get out of the press conferences and move more to the people and give you the human interest stories that you'd like. I heard one of the speakers earlier talking about how, you'll see this on the SABC and a bit later you'll hear it on community radio, but that is actually what COVID-19 is forcing us to shy away from, because it is no longer about us and sounding the same as our competitors. It is about being able to broaden the scope and give you even more stories than you normally would. When you switch on your TV, there's press conferences all day, but what is it about your platform and your space that kind of gives me additional information that I wouldn't otherwise get from those technical briefings, etc. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. I don't know if there's any questions or anybody seeks clarity.
Thank you.
Thank
you so much, Neo. We have one question. There is someone raised their hand. Her name is Sindiso. Yeah, Sindiso. Over to you, Sindiso.
It's Sindiso. It's actually a D. All right. Mulisheng, to our Zambian brothers tuning in, and Sanbunan to everyone. So I have a few questions. I'm Sindiso from the Communication Student Association at UNISA. Okay. And as Nell was speaking, and I'm thinking at the back of what was it Max? I think it was Max. Presentation as well, in terms of the engagement of the media, of the communicator, or from a government perspective with the media and all that, and the growth of fake news and all these platforms that have been available currently, one of them being StreamYard, others being Zoom, you find Magic as well, so basically these platforms, you can create a whole media channel on your laptop with just a simple account, and you can basically do fake news as much as you like. Some of these can be cloned so that the IPN can't be traced. So that makes carrying out what the policy is holding people liable for fake news accountable a lot more harder, because now if the IPN can't be traced, how are you then going to find whoever is projecting that? Then you have AI. Last year, as COMSA, we had a conference on the evolution of the fourth industrial revolution, on the fourth industrial revolution itself. And Dr. Petrus de Kock from Brand South Africa highlighted the fact that machines now can literally write an article as if somebody actually was there. And that So as much as there are these resources available to keep accountability, like the media monitor and all of that, it's really hard to really say that there is enough being done, because of the fact that technology has advanced to a stage whereby you really can't tell immediately if it's fake news, and if the people who can project that this is not the actual facts are not being able to come across a lot more clearer. I know that people are just not up for watching 404 or 405 or 403 nowadays. It's like, nah, they'll rather watch a Twitter stream and see what's going on. Then if it's interesting, then do research. And if people are reliant on that type of platform for news, it's hard to then trust media speaking on what you've basically said because of that. Lastly, I wanted to basically speak on in terms of the impact of COVID in terms of the live events. I'm somebody who's coming from a creative space before going back to school, and I've seen the impact that it has on the creative space in itself, to a point of I'm more worried as how the information is going to be broadcast, how the opportunities are going to be utilized for it to transfer into a normality as we go back into maybe level 1 or whatnot. It's things like that that basically then, that's a side note on my side. How do we then start introducing live events in terms of trying to ensure that we kickstart that type of sector, which is reliant on events such as the live platforms, sports, whether it's theaters, events. Now hotels can't even host shows anymore. You just come and sleep, and that's the end of it. So now the other streams of income that the hotel used to have, like entertainment at the bar and stuff like that, has really been impacted. That I'm a bit worried in terms of how we then going to be able to do it, knowing what is happening now and the pandemic we're facing currently. Thank you.
Thanks, Cindy. So you raise very important questions. In terms of basically holding people to account on the fake news, I think that's a bigger discussion that relates to the regulation of use of cyberspace in general, right? But I think that with the regulations that have been put in place, whether or not you find the perpetrator of these platforms, or people are setting up their own newsrooms digitally, those can easily be taken down. And as I said in my presentation, the trust deficit, the only thing that helps us out is the fact that people are using reliable platforms. So there are certain spaces, you know, for a fact, based on reputation and the type of credible news they've been giving over a period, that these are my go-to people. Does this disadvantage new and upcoming platforms? Absolutely. But does this then, give credence to some of these platforms that are already existing, giving new names on their platforms as is? You also asked about AI, and you said that computers or robots can write the stories. Yes, I agree, they actually can. But one of the last points that I made is that COVID is forcing us to move back to the people and tell human interest stories. I don't think that is something that you can get from a robot or a computer. There's a specific way creatives tell their stories, storytellers who unearth these unique stories from even these remote areas that I spoke about. You cannot get the same experience in reading those stories as you would from something that is written by a bot. It would obviously then sound something that is a bit more similar to a press release, which I don't think is what people are looking for, which has led to the escapism that I was talking about. Because once a bot starts giving you the facts, that's all that they're giving you. And then that leads to the information overload and the COVID fatigue. You then spoke about the event industry and kickstarting those sectors. The reality, and I was saying this to people in my newsroom, is that right now, fate is basically in our hands. Whether we like it or not, government has done what it needs to do and placed regulations in place for us to follow. So whether or not we're going to move to level 1 is going to be dependent on whether you and I are sitting in rooms, having parties, not following regulations, and also not trying to think of creative ways in which we can make those industries open up. I think if you look at Italy, if you look at Korea, they've figured out a way of starting to have these events and open up. For example, restaurants. You can have segmented areas for restaurants so that those industries can continue to thrive. You don't necessarily have to have live events with full capacity. You can even bring in this that you speak about, Zoom and some of these other platforms. So I think that the onus is then on us to ensure that we come up with those ways to ensure that we move to those levels and kind of reintroduce normal life. And just between you and I don't think life will ever be normal ever again, to be honest. I think that we need to adapt to, and this is a term that I hate, the so-called new normal. We need to start thinking about what life will be, because unfortunately, from the information that we've heard, COVID is going to be with us for a long time coming. Does this create opportunity? Absolutely. This actually challenges you to see where the gaps in the market are, so that even in those industries that are reopening, there's even other ways for you to make even more money than you would have before. And that's it for me.
Thank you, Neo. I like when you highlight how COVID-19 has changed the media landscape in the country. Like you highlighted that in the past, we had more journalists specializing on political reporting, and we had more analysts on political reporting. But this outbreak of coronavirus has really forced media houses to look at creating their own database of experts. And also it has showed us that there's a lack when it comes to health reporters. So I think really it is true that COVID-19 has touched every sector in our society. So moving right along, Onalyn, now have a follow-up question there. Over to you.
I'm not sure if Onalyn is with us. We're not hearing anything on this end.
I think they're in the auditorium, so they have muted their mic. Ishmael should unmute.
Okay. Am I audible now?
Yes.
Slightly, yes.
Okay. All right. Did you not hear a single thing? Should I start over?
Yeah, sure. Please start over.
Okay. I was just saying, part of online journalism, I didn't want us to confuse fake news with an influx of information or overload of information and misinterpret that for fake news. So I believe that part of online journalism was for different people to come together and share views, some of which were unknown, for instance, that are not reported in mainstream media. For example, in the villages, you have a plant which is brewed to control or get rid of flu symptoms, a plant called lingana. I don't know the English term for it, but there was an article that police are looking for people who are using it. I don't know whether to arrest them or what actions they want to take against those people. So I want to know how do we make up for the misrepresentation of information as fake news? And could that also follow up? Could that be a lack of independent indigenous language platforms which are there? Is there a lack of knowledge that is coming from people from the villages who may actually have a say on, like you say, there's a lack of journalism in terms of living a healthy lifestyle. So could that be there a lack of that information coming from different parts of our communities, particularly from the villages?
Okay, before I let you go and before I answer this, I just need you to clarify something. How is the fake news misconstrued because of an influx of information? I'm confused.
Well, for instance, now if I'm somebody from the villages and I have access to a phone, I have access to a platform where I can write news, and I write about this plant that I told you about.
Yes.
And it helps to slow down flu symptoms or helps relieve flu symptoms.
I'm familiar with it.
Yes, maybe using it just as they that you drink warm water with lemon and ginger, maybe using this plant, brewing it, boiling it, and drinking it could reduce your chances of catching a cold, therefore spreading droplets and trying to protect yourself from COVID-19. Do you understand? How would that? How do you stop it from being called fake news? Is that not my opinion as a person? Or how can we set up measures so that people's opinions can actually be tested instead of actually just deeming the story as fake news because it doesn't correlate with what scientists are saying and what the mainstream media is saying should be consumed to keep yourself healthy and away from the virus?
Okay. So, Unalina, firstly, for me, I don't think that any Black child in South Africa at this moment would say that Lingana is illegal and that police need to arrest people. I think a lot of us grew up on it. And as you mentioned, a lot of people in the rural areas use it quite often. I think we're all familiar with the fact that if you have flu symptoms, a grandmother or somebody will actually give you access to that. So you use it. So I don't understand why that would be something that anybody would be arrested for. But in terms of the fake news, I hear what you're saying, and I actually remember those articles, with people saying that because it was used in, I can't remember which country it was used in, I didn't think it was Mozambique or Madagascar, one of the two, saying that it's the miracle cure. I think that the danger with that was what was being highlighted as opposed to the criminality of it. The reality is that there is no cure for COVID-19, and maybe it is a lack of access to information, but everybody knows that there's no cure. So bringing Lingana in as a miracle cure for COVID-19 is essentially fake news because that's not true. Does it help with flu symptoms? Absolutely. But is it a cure? Absolutely not. So maybe it's about the access, as you said. Maybe that is a problem. And as I said in my presentation, we are now forced to get to those areas and make sure that we're not only telling their stories, but we're disseminating information to them as well. COVID-19 is evening out the playing field for the reach that everybody has. I remember somebody asking Max about feeding into the SABC, feeding into local community radio stations. That's actually something that is happening. So what we're having is there's a lot of pool feeds that are provided to streamline this information into the much smaller platform so that it actually has a wider reach. So that is how you can discern into fake news, is because now we are actually giving access to all of our resources, to even the smallest of areas. So misinformation potentially, but that is not without a lack of trying, to be quite honest with you. And also the only way that we can end fake news is that when you do see these these articles or you read these stories, there are actually platforms where you can report this, or fact check platforms. I mean, when you go on Google or when you go into your apps, there are so many things that you can use to actually fact check. So I think that we are kind of, we're not where we used to be in terms of bridging that gap, to be honest. I'll give it back to Irene.
Thank you so much, Neo. We have a hand from Malusi. Over to you, Malusi. Please unmute your mic, Malusi. You may. We still can't hear you. Malusi, we still can't hear you.
Hello.
Yes, you may speak.
Right. Okay. Finally. As I was saying, I'm an investment promotions intern at the Department of Environment, Forestry, and Fisheries. I'm a public relations graduate. So the last presentation was very informative for me, and it got me thinking about my future. You know, as an intern, my career is still in its infancy. So I just wanted to know, like, what is the future for like the old traditional media forms? You know, like your prints and other like old traditional forms, because maybe in future we might get an opportunity to work on one of these forms, and nobody wants to join climb on a sinking ship. So what exactly does the future hold for those type of media forms and media platforms? Thank you.
Thank you for that. In the opening remarks, I spoke about how financing and the death of advertising is actually having a ripple effect on media houses. The unfortunate reality is that print has been a dying medium for a while now. You would have noted magazines that have now had to shut down. Newspapers such as the Mail and Guardian openly saying that they no longer have the funds to keep their doors open and relying on donations and funding from crowdfunding. The old style of journalism is not necessarily dying out. It's in the delivery that we need to kind of be innovative. The reality is that even with print, they will have to go digital. And the same way that you used to present your newspaper articles will now have to actually be online. A lot of it relies on funding. If you can get the funding for it, then you can keep it open. But in this day and age, especially under COVID-19, funding is difficult even for the regular broadcasters, and even more so for newspapers and magazines, etc. I think that I'm not quite certain whether or not we'll be able to resuscitate it, but with our move towards the digital, I don't think that there is enough room for that. So the journalism, is there room for that? Absolutely. It's in the delivery that I think that we need to kind of be different, and don't be afraid to move your career in that direction. If you think you're an old school journalist and you want to tell the stories like they used to in the newspapers, do that. Deliver it in just a different way. There's so many different options, and so many different platforms for you to let this reality live out. You could even create a platform of your own. With podcasts being on the rise, that could be something that you could look into. With different episodes that you could put on Facebook, on YouTube. There's even IGTV now. I mean, the world is your oyster. You could even have, your own set of stories that you put out on, I think it's Spotify and SoundCloud. So I don't think that, this should deter you from, trying your luck out, or maybe trying yourself out and seeing if journalism is for you. There are plenty other options and plenty other ways that, your ideas can creatively still exist. Irene?
Thank you, Neo. I'll take a question from, yes, Melusi, do you have a follow-up? Okay, I'll take the last question from Zikanyile. Over to you, Zikanyile.
Thank you. Afternoon, everyone. Firstly, let me just say I'm grateful for this platform because I think it's a platform that's been needed, especially for up and coming communicators within government, because there's I'm not sure whether to say a disjuncture is the right word, but there's a way in which when it comes to taking the message across to media, Mr. Paloi, no Pramex, they stated, Novana, we need the media as to bring them closer to us so that they can be able to say the message across in a positive way. But now my question is, when it comes to COVID, we're getting a lot of stories and we're getting a lot of coverage, and we're getting a lot of people who see themselves as the social journalists who are not exactly trained to be saying the messages out there. How do we now bring everyone back so that the messages that we're sending out, the messages that the media is sending out, especially in our different departments that we're working on, because each and every department will have their own focus. They have their own focus audience, where they have to say a message relating to COVID to that audience. And also, another thing that I've seen is that when it comes to now, the past 6 months, it's as if we've forgotten the other problems or challenges that we are working with, and now we are solely on COVID. We are solely on sanitization, solely on this. But now, what happened to the other issues that we had? Does it mean now that because we have this pandemic and we are suffering from this, all the other issues that we've been struggling with, facing and all that, are they now on the so how do we bring everyone back, the focus? How do we shift the focus so that COVID is not something foreign? It's something that it's something that is here and we are all working with, we are all moving with. But now, how do we bring the focus back into all other issues that we've had before? And moving forward with those issues and this new issue now, how do we go forward? Thank you.
Thank you for that, Zikanyile. I think that the reality is that with lockdown, you couldn't bring everybody back, because the reality is that everybody's life was at a standstill because of this COVID-19, which kind of explains why, it's not that we were ignoring other issues. We were highlighting the many ways in which they were amplified because of COVID. And I think that gradually, if you pay attention to the news now, we are slowly bringing people back, because there are other things that we're dealing with not separate from COVID, because unfortunately where we are right now, we can't separate it. And for as long as it's with us, we kind of have to tell you that yes, unemployment is an issue, but this is the ways in which COVID has made it even a bigger issue. And the reality is that we as journalists need to be able to tell you, I can't say to you, for example, that unemployment has now increased to 30%, but I don't tell you what the mitigating factors are. I need to tell you why unemployment has now risen to this point. And it's just unfortunate that, too much of people's annoyance, it's because of COVID-19. It's because, there's certain industries that have had to shut down. I need to tell you why the events industry is not working, why tourism is at an all-time low, and why there is growing concern for the aviation industry. COVID cannot be separated from the information that I'm telling you. I think that the way in which we disseminate the information is always telling of the times. I mean, there were the so-called, those years in South Africa where you could not say that we are here as a country without telling me why we got here or how we got here. Part of explaining to you why we are where we are and where we will be is telling you what the factors that contributed to it are. I don't know, ultimately, in 2 or 3 years down the line, how we're then going to bring everybody back according to you and then, just restructure our way of thinking. I don't think that's possible, to be honest. And I don't think that I think it would be disingenuous of me as a journalist to tell you and focus on all these other issues and not explain to you why, in the periphery, COVID-19 is still a factor in all those issues, to be honest. Irene?
Thank you so much, Neo, and to all our participants. We have come to the end of our program, so Mr. William Baloyi will come and do the closing remarks. But if I may highlight, thank you, Max. You did highlight the importance of a communicator during a crisis. I liked how you gave an example about the story of Fort Kruger, how they had to take ownership of the issue and communicate. So the pointers from Meg's presentation was that as a communicator during a crisis, you have to be accessible. So your phones can't be off and you can't give responses like no comments, because he did highlight that when you say no comment, it means like you are not concerned about the issue. So as a communicator, you have to act quick and gather the facts so that you are able to respond quickly. And I also liked how he highlighted that as a communicator during a crisis, you are the source of the information and you have to be the source, because if you don't put out information, accurate information, then journalists will have to run with whatever information that is available and accessible to them at that point. And I also liked how Daniel then came on board to share how corporate communication managed the crisis. He did highlight that as a corporate organization, you have to deal with customer relations and you have to make sure that your customers are happy at all times. Even during a crisis, as a corporate, you have to meet the communities halfway, like by having programs like this corporate social responsibility program, where you meet your customers halfway and have some benefits or incentives that you put forward to assist your customers. And I like what they are doing there in MTN in Zambia. He said that every day they put out messages in local languages to their customers just to educate them about COVID-19 and how they can prevent the spread of the virus in their communities. And then thank you, Neo, also for highlighting the role of the media during this time. I have noted a point from you that during this time of COVID-19, journalists had to come together and find ways to reach the communities. Like, I like what the SABC has been doing with other broadcasters by providing them with a pool feed, because one of the measures that we have to adhere to is the social distancing. So when the government hold press conferences, then it's not possible for all journalists from all media houses to attend those press conferences because of the issue of social distances. So the SABC then had to provide the pool feed, be the main broadcaster, and give other media houses the pool feed. And I also liked how you challenging all of us to say, as communicators, this is a time for us to also assist government to deal with the issue of fake news. So let's verify information before we even press the share button. So I think that's something that we can take home from this masterclass. So Mr. Baloyi will come and just do the closing remarks. Thank you so much to all our masters and all our participants.
No, thank you very much, Irene, for the way you drove this interesting engagement. Though I can assure you that we would have loved to have more time on this, and at some point in time go to specifics. But at least this is a good sign that we need more of this interaction, and we need to open it to also involve our colleagues, especially interns from different government departments, but not only to wait for this. Let me also send a special thanks to our guests for today, the three speakers. I think you gave us a base for debate, but you gave us a base for challenge to say how do we address some of the issues that you have raised. But I need to also indicate, colleagues, that as I've said, we don't have a template of this. It's for the first time that we are going through this COVID-19. The most important thing is how to, as we go, how to make sure that we learn from each other's experiences. Let me touch on a few issues that the colleagues have raised, though Irene has answered most of them. I think there was this interesting question of how do we encourage the adults to start using technology. Colleagues, you might remember that before the phenomenon or the pandemic hits in reality, there was talk, let me be specific to South Africa. There was talk of 4IR. We even have a department, especially for the promotion of 4IR, and it's led by Minister Stella Ndabeni. She had road shows trying to encourage that. But as you remember, there is a saying between Mohammed and the mountain that if another one doesn't go to another one will go to them. So the pandemic provided us with a speed, not to say we were not going to the mountain or the mountain was not going to Mohammed, but provided us with the speed of saying, you better rush. That's why immediately we had to go into lockdown. We had to move beyond the reasonable speed that we are moving with to make sure that we adapt. And I can assure you that we have adapted very quickly. One of the examples of that adaptation is what we are having today. We are able to interact with each other. We interacted with our colleague in Zambia. We interacted with Max. We interacted with Leo. We interacted with other colleagues that participated from Cape Town, from different departments and all over. So it means that we were quickly forced to adapt to this. So we are still now polishing that thing. So whether we like it or not, we are in it. And there is no going back. As Leo has indicated, we won't be the same. Life has changed. The mode of communication has changed. How we interact has changed. And maybe to give also this update, yesterday, for the very first time, GCIS, we are based in the capital city, in Tshwane, in Pretoria, but we are able to host parliament. When the minister delivered the emergency budget yesterday, he was doing it right from where I was standing, but we were connected to a national parliament in Cape Town, where he was also delivering it to them. So that has never happened before in South Africa. But because of adapting to the new ways that have been brought upon by this COVID pandemic, we were able to do it. And we think that it also exposed us in terms of your technological advances, where we have to fill there and there, and we'll do that. That is work in progress. On the issue of the community radio, I was quite happy that the issue was touched, and the question that was raised to say community radio sometimes in terms of reporting on events, they are late. That is more of a programming issue. I think Leo knows that it's within the editorial, that other side. But we will add, from what we have said, we'll also make sure that we add this particular experience to them to say, colleagues, for community radios to be relevant, make sure that you are also timers. You are on time. And we, to that extent, as GCIS, we have also played our role. We have encourage community radios that will give them news bulletins twice a day. And we encourage them to switch us on, to link us with them so that we specifically assist them with the news bulletins. But also the importance of community radio colleagues is that they can use the local language of where they are based, and that assists in making sure that the languages in South Africa are alive. So that partnership will strengthen it going forward, and that is a good thing that colleagues you have touched on that one. But there is also this question, this issue of the shrinking newsrooms. I think colleagues in the media will tell you that there's been loss of jobs in the different news media houses. Why? Because firstly of the challenges that we have of COVID-19, but the phenomenon of job losses was there even before the COVID-19, and the challenge has been brought about by the diversity. If you look at the sharing of news now, you also indicated the issue of people, consumers of news. They want to consume news and quickly for that matter. And also with the advent of your latest Android and other cell phones, people then can consume news quickly on that. And that it challenges also the traditional way of consuming news to be changed and how the news is disseminated. Hence, we have seen some of the publications closing, which is not a good thing at all. But it's still, I think, something that we'll look at as we proceed and we revolutionize how we communicate. But obviously, the issue of streaming and podcast has also entered the market. And the way they have entered the market, obviously, they are affecting the whole issue that there was the lifeblood of the mainstream media adjustment, that is advertising. So the advertising budgets have shrunk in different broadcasters. Let me give you an example that in the study that was done of between 2014 and 18, radio revenue on advertising grew from 3.9 billion in 2014 to 4.2 billion in 2018. I mean 2014 to 2018. But now, since the advent of the corona pandemic, I can assure you that when the next report comes, things would have changed. They would have gone a little bit lower. TV also moved from 6.6 billion in 2014 to 7.5 billion in 2018. But now the chunk of that was on the free-to-air, still the mainstay of what people look. So those are the challenges that we'll have to look at. And I'm happy that today we're able to share those aspects. But the good side of it is that the culture of promoting listening and a spoken word is increasing. That's what I like. And with those words, I want to thank the organizers and to thank also the participants. And we hope to see you again next year. And thank you very much, the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We have come to the end of our webinar. Thank you.